Well, UCLA has some reason to have some confidence going into this matchup against Oregon, but there's certainly some reason for some concern. Let's talk about it on this episode of Locked On UCLA. Let's hit that music, everybody.
You are Locked On UCLA, your daily podcast on the UCLA Bruins. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, everybody, it's Zach Anderson-Yoxsimer. You're listening to Locked On UCLA. Thanks for making Locked On UCLA your first listen each and every day. Just telling you that this episode's brought to you by SweatBlock. If someone you love is experiencing embarrassing sweat or odor, try SweatBlock. Save 20% with the promo code LOCKEDON on SweatBlock.com. It's also available on Amazon. This episode is brought to you by SweatBlock. In the meantime, UCLA, let's get right to it. Locked On UCLA. Thanks for the support. It's free wherever you get your podcasts, so thanks for making it your first listen each and every day. For the Bruins, I already talked about it a little bit. There are some keys to the game. There's more keys to the game to talk about, but today we're talking about some sources of concerns and things that UCLA needs to stop when facing a top 10 Oregon squad at home, facing lots of weather and everything that goes into the college game day atmosphere that is in Eugene in Autzen Stadium. So for the Bruins, all right, here we go. Coming off of a big win against Utah, they get the bye, and then so does Oregon. They get a bye after a crushing beatdown of Arizona, followed by the big crushing beatdown of Stanford the week prior to them, and then they get a bye too. So both teams coming off a bye week to play this one. No advantage or disadvantage either way. They're coming all things equal heading into that matchup this Saturday afternoon in Oregon. Oregon has a clear advantage when it comes to the offensive line when coming into this game when facing a UCLA defensive line. You know, the Bruins have found ways to get pressure, and coming into the the Utah game, for the most part, they've been able to stop the run. But in UCLA, in their semi-closer games, they have been rushing attacks that they've been unable to truly stop. They had the Utah game where UCLA, until they pulled away late, did allow over 190 yards rushing. The Bruins got outrushed against South Alabama in a game that was a 1-point game. And now they're going to face an Oregon attack that comes in with just a true weaponry of rushing offense. Their rushing attack is just fantastic. Overall, this season, Oregon comes in averaging per game 241 rushing yards per game. And while some of those can be bulked up from the likes of Eastern Washington, from beating Stanford and Arizona teams who you can run all over this season, still, when Oregon has success, it comes when they run the football. When they did not find ways to have success running the football, and in their case, although 150 yards, 140 yards rushing is not the worst total in the world, when they had under 200 yards rushing, the Ducks, when they struggled against Washington State, that's when they had less than 200 yards rushing. And, well, the game against Georgia speaks for itself, but that's when they also had under 200 yards rushing. But where Oregon has, as I mentioned, that offensive line advantage, they're returning 5 of their 6 offensive linemen. They have one of the best offensive linemen in TJ Bass, who's a 4-time career Pac-12 of the Week Offensive Lineman Award winner, including twice this season. They have some solid award winners on both the offensive and defensive lines. And again, this is a similar like scenario where UCLA heading into that Washington game is facing a quarterback on the opposite side that truly hasn't been taken down all too often. In 5 of the 6 games for Oregon this season, they have not allowed a sack, and they've only allowed 1 sack this year. And while they've generated 13 sacks defensively, it is their offensive line that's been help keeping not only just Bo Nix up, but helping generate the rushing attack. And while UCLA's front will have a different coaching, they'll be coached up, they'll have a different front than what Arizona and Stanford and what Oregon's faced so far. But if they can find ways to do the same things like Washington State, you're not going to say do the same thing as Georgia, but they can do things consistently throughout the game. Well, that's one thing, but it's Oregon who's coming off 2 back-to-back just fantastic performances running the football. If you go game by game, against Washington State, the Ducks ran for 178 yards officially, 140 against Georgia. Then follow those 2 weeks up against Washington State with their big time comeback. It was 351 yards against Stanford, and then they ran for 306 yards against Arizona. Just a fantastic, fantastic number where they just ran all over the Wildcats. Just spectacular that they're coming in, going to the bye, clicking on all cylinders coming into this one. And this is a UCLA defense that just allowed 190 yards rushing to Utah, who came in with not as gaudy numbers as Oregon did. But for the Bruins, they're facing a very stout offensive line where the Ducks returned a lot from the previous year. And reminder, the Ducks won this matchup last year. They were down early and then came back and had a lead and almost had to choke it late for UCLA to even have a chance to come back, but the Bruins did. And both teams are averaging over 40 points per game, close to 42 to 41. And with UCLA, they're coming off a game where, hey, they didn't necessarily stop the run all too often. And while they did look menacing offensively and got the key stops when they needed to defensively against the Utes, is that promising against an Oregon team that's going to come in and want to run it down your throat? They've got a three-headed attack, do the Ducks. And it's not just one guy like UCLA. It's Charbonnet to run the ball and DTR to play off of that and Keegan Jones any other time. For the Ducks, it's three-man attack. You have Bucky Irving, who goes about 71.5 yards per game and hasn't had to be overworked in some of those blowout wins for the Ducks. You have Noah Whittingham, who also rushes for over 56 yards a game. Those guys have combined for 4 rushing touchdowns. And hey, Oregon's got a dual threat quarterback themselves in Bo Nix, who sits there with 8 rushing touchdowns, including a long run of the year of 80 yards. That's even longer than DTR's, or not, excuse me, fairly close to DTR's longest run of the year. DTR ran for an 87-yard score against Bowling Green in week 1. So Bo Nix also has his 80-yard run. He averages 50 yards per game. A lot of that bulked up from the 140-yard rushing performance against Stanford, but this is a team where they thrive off the run, like Chip Kelly, they knew how to go up tempo, run, boom, boom, all these big plays. It's flashy. Well, it's not Chip Kelly, it's Dan Lanning for the Ducks, but the Bruins don't stand up and come up defensively. They're gonna struggle in a game where weather will be a factor. It's gonna rain all throughout this game. Looking at the forecast, about 100% chance of precipitation, rain, whatever you want to call it, whatever we don't get in SoCal, even though we've gotten it lately. You have Chip Kelly, videos of him just using water balls to squirt water on the punt returner, get everything ready. The other thing is the Bruins have to be prepared for the weather and not just the heat like it's been or the odd SoCal weather that we had in late August through September, leading into October. It's the rain, which is also going to be something the Bruins have to get acclimated to. Oregon has not lost a fumble this year, and the Bruins, they had their problems with a couple of pitches and handoffs in that South Alabama game. They've kind of cleaned that up for the most part, but can they keep their hands on the football and not cough it up when the moment and the moment shines bright? It's key with the weather, running the football. Which team will run the ball more effectively and not cough it up with the rain? Those are some key factors going in, and Oregon comes in a rare team that runs it even better coming into the game than UCLA. It's going to be interesting as we'll see how the Bruins can atone for that. All of this is what's going to happen. What are we going to see the Bruins adjust, and can they get that pressure? Can they find a way when Bo Nix is back to pass to pressure him? Well, we can talk about one specific individual who, he's gotten some accolades, but let's talk about SweatBlock because it's going to be a hard working day. There's high humidity in Eugene that day. We're all going to be sweating it out wherever we're watching this game. It's supposed to be a hot week leading up, although maybe a cooler SoCal day, whatever it is on Saturday, middle of the day. We're going to be sweating through it. I know I'm going to be sweating through, and, if I have excessive underarm sweat or if I'm going to sweat through, it's going to be a little stinky. It is what it is. Just know that with SweatBlock, all you have to do is just go to sweatblock.com. You can get a 20% off promo code. Use the 2-word promo code locked on. And if you or someone you love is experiencing embarrassing sweat or odor, just know that It was created by a doctor to help his own excessive sweating. It's doctor created and it's doctor recommended. So if you have embarrassing sweat, you don't need to stink anymore. We don't need to have embarrassing sweat. Trust me, I sweat a lot. I don't want to stink anymore. Let's not do this. All we have to do is save 20% or more with the promo code locked on at sweatblock.com. It's also available on Amazon. Let's stop stinking. In the meantime, who's not stinking? It's Laiatu Latu, who, as we mentioned, will be a bit of a key. He's been getting some midseason accolades. Laiatu Latu listed as the AP All-America Midseason as a we'll start that again. He is on the AP All-America Midseason Team as an edge rusher, number 2 in college football when it comes to sacks, tied for number 2. And for him, a guy who thought that his career is over. Laiatu Latu transferring from Washington, no appearances in 2020, in 2021, and then coming into 2022, just being cleared before the season, transferring to UCLA in January after Washington had their head coaching regime change. He comes through, has had 19 total tackles, 14 solo, and just come through and been a wrecking force. 5 of the last 6 games, he's gotten a tackle at least, multiple tackles, 7 tackles for loss, 6.5 sacks, including a couple of forced fumbles, a QB hurry. In each of the last 3 straight games, it's been Laiatu Latu who has gotten at least half a sack, usually more than that, including against Washington. Who was it that sacked Michael Penix Jr. the first time? It was Laiatu Latu. So if there's ever a guy to try and penetrate this very, very stout Oregon offensive line coming in for the Ducks, it would be Laiatu Latu, who, I mean, he can't, it's not going to be like that Colorado game where he came through and got 3 sacks. They're not facing that type of offensive line. But this is a guy who can maybe get a sack against an Oregon team, as I mentioned before, who's only allowed a sack in one of their previous 6 games. In their previous 6 games, they only allowed 1 sack. And other than that, 5 games without a sack. I think against Arizona, they didn't even have a single tackle for loss allowed offensively. So this is Laiatu Latu, a chance for him to kind of do what he did to Michael Penix Jr., take him down and just sack him, kind of get him flustered, see if they can fluster Bo Nix, whether it is getting a big play, tackle for loss. Laiatu Latu is a big key. And again, this is a guy who was not supposed to play. He was ruled medically ineligible, medically retired by the Washington doctors. Transfers and out of nowhere has been a spectacular find for UCLA recruiting in the transfer portal, which we've discussed ad nauseum in this podcast in different times. How UCLA transfer you, the joke, yes, whatever it may be. But Laiatu Latu getting a second chance, just showing kind of the players that Chip Kelly is trying to get, those hard workers, those guys who grind day in and day out. Even Latu, who was told he had to medically retire, finding ways, the redshirt junior from Sacramento, California, transferring from Washington. And in 12 of 13 games in Washington, he made just a few tackles, batted down a pass, didn't have some crazy spectacular numbers overall. But as a true freshman, that's you're not always expecting things from edge rushers. In high school, he was a guy that was on the USA Today's All California First Team, so had some good prospectus, a top 300 ESPN rated guy, number 122 in the nation overall as a recruit, and was getting some love coming from high school recruiting. Didn't really pan out those first 3 years, a lot of that because of the medical reasons. And then here he's come and been a crucial part for UCLA, and he'll be a crucial part of the defensive game plan to try and stop the Oregon rushing attack. And when Bo Nix goes back to throw, try and rush a passer that not too many times has been flustered, especially as of late. The Ducks are really clicking all cylinders as of late. 40 plus points outside of that Georgia game. For the most part, they've been running the ball fantastically. Can he penetrate a veteran returning offensive line group? And it's Laiatu Latu who's trying to get through a very solid unit. Can he be one of the keys on a UCLA defense that does have, John Vines? If news coming out of practice, I believe Ben Bolch tweeting it out saying he seems a little banged up. His status for the game undetermined. What can stand up? Well, it's Laiatu Latu, who is on the AP All-America Midseason Team. All right. Well, who wasn't on that team? Well, you could argue about Zach Charbonnet, but all the attention has been flashing to UCLA quarterback. How can we try and say he should have been on the team? We'll talk about that, but we need to talk about some LinkedIn jobs first. In the meantime, for LinkedIn jobs, these days, every new potential hire can feel like a high stakes wager for your small business. That's what I want to wager in a few moments with DTR and the AP All-America Midseason Team. But you want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best qualified candidates available. That's why you want to check out LinkedIn Jobs, as LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster and for free. You can use the screening tools to make it easy to focus on the candidates with the right skills and experience so you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and hire. That's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs number one in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates that you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. All right, while Laiatu Latu was the only Bruin on that AP All-America midseason team, a lot of love has been coming the way for the UCLA quarterback, Dorian Thompson-Robinson. And while he was not listed on that team, his Heisman odds have continued to grow in favor of him. For Dorian Thompson-Robinson, obviously, he's been one of the key cogs, not only as a leader off on the field, but off the field, being that leader, that fifth-year leader who's been here as long as Chip Kelly has. And for Dorian Thompson-Robinson, if they released this AP All-America list a week earlier, he arguably could have been on it. Looking between him and Hendon Hooker, the Tennessee starting quarterback, who also is an older QB. He's a 24-year-old, sixth-year senior for the Tennessee Volunteers. And of course, it comes out after a Tennessee quarterback throws for almost 4 bills against the Alabama defense with 5 touchdowns, which is arguably going to get you some good numbers. But if he hadn't had that big game against Alabama, maybe through 5 games, and you could argue with Dorian Thompson-Robinson not playing too much against Alabama State, they would have similar numbers. Hendon Hooker, who's on that quarterback list, comes in with 1,800 yards, over 1,800 yards passing, 15 touchdowns, and an interception, and then 287 rush yards with 3 touchdowns. DTR, through his 6 games heading into the bye week, had 1,500 yards, 15 touchdowns through the air, 2 picks, and 231 rush yards with 4 touchdowns. Mind you, it's Hendon Hooker who's played more than DTR has, because you can say DTR was taken out very early in that Alabama State game. They brought in Garbers very early. That's when the offense started clicking. It looked more like, if you remember that Alabama State game in week 2, where the Bruins are like, all right, DTR a little bit trip up. We're going to take him out. And for the Bruins, you could argue if you take away a little bit of Hooker's last week's numbers, he threw for 5 touchdowns against Alabama, which means it took him 5 touchdowns just to equal Dorian Thompson-Robinson's passing yards. DTR's had both an 87-yard touchdown run to a 70-yard passing touchdown. Hendon Hooker, who does have a few more rushing yards, but it's 50 rushing yards. Well, DTR was kind of hampered because, again, the Alabama State game and other games. But for the most part, you could argue Dorian Thompson-Robinson is just as deserving to be on that AP All-America midseason team. But in the end, it comes down to who's going to be invited to the Heisman Trophy room, who will be the Pac-12 Offensive Player of the Year, who's going to be on the QB lists. There's so many of them nowadays. And it's 2 older quarterbacks who are leading the list. And you could argue Dorian Thompson-Robinson will have his moments. Yet Hendon Hooker, who had absolutely his moment in his win over Alabama at home. And Bruins have good memories in Knoxville in recent times. And while we all wish that 1998 was UCLA, Tennessee for a national championship, in the end, who knows? Maybe 2022 we'll see that this year. But for the Bruins, Dorian Thompson-Robinson is having a fantastic season, and people who are overlooking him early are not overlooking him now. DTR, who has simply just been, there's no words for it. There are people who are calling for Chip Kelly's head, and DTR to no longer be the quarterback before this season. And yet, here he is, arguably with maybe not as gaudiest stats, with Hooker coming off a crazy performance, but he's putting up numbers with the best of the QBs who are arguably near the top of the Heisman Trophy lists at the moment. He's kind of creeping his way up into the shorter list for the Heisman Trophy finalists. And also for midseason awards, I'm sitting here arguing that he should be around that list for a quarterback across the entire nation. Well, DTR is going to have his moment against Oregon. He didn't play in Oregon in 2020. Remember, that was Chase Griffin. The Bruins still could have and should have won that game in Eugene 2 years ago in front of no crowd against the Ducks, one of kind of back-to-back crushing your losses. And last year, it was DTR who was banged up and had to come out early on that final potential game-winning or game-tying drive against Oregon. This weekend's will be DTR's Heisman moment. It needs to be for him to show out and prove, hey, all right, the Bruins, he always keeps the receipts. This needs to be his Heisman moment this weekend against the Ducks. And I know there's the SC game later, but this is one where all the eyes are on you again for a third straight week or third straight game in 4 weeks, and the eyes are on DTR. So we'll see if he can tell the voters, hey, you messed up on your mid-season list. You released it 1 week too late, because he probably would have been on it. You can comment, subscribe, and comment and say, hey, you disagree, whatever it may be, but you can't argue DTR has been nothing short of fantastic this year, as many are now finally seeing. But here we are with the Bruins 6-0, 3-0. The dreams start, and we'll see how the Bruins and DTR and Chip Kelly can go through the weather with the rain, navigate the crowd, navigate an Oregon team that's starting to be, a team that is much better than their week one showing showed. So can the Bruins come through, get a win in Oregon for the first time in nearly 2 decades, and find a way to once again probably still shock the nation one more time by getting a win against the Ducks? Laiatu Latu, you have DTR, and you have to stop the vaunted Ducks run offense to get any hope of getting a defensive stop. Those are all big things coming into the weekend. In the meantime, thanks for tuning in to Locked On UCLA. Got to go check out Locked On Pac-12 to make that your second listen with Spencer McLaughlin. Our crossover between him as the Locked On Ducks host and Locked On UCLA, that'll come in later in the week. In the meantime, get your hands up in the air, Bruins fans. A clap time. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. UCLA. UCLA. Fight, fight, fight. This has been Locked On UCLA. Go Bruins.